Buffalo, everyone, and welcome to the first Vassals of Kingsgrave read through the Witcher series by Andrzej Sapkowski. I am Paul, SerDinnerRoll on the forums, and I'm going to be hosting this episode. And joining today are my fellow Witchers, bards, and sorceresses. First up is Michal.
Hi, Inkasrain on the forums, and fellow Witcher fanatic. Thanks, Paul.
You're welcome. Abby.
Hi, DaceyMormont on the forums, and skeptic of The Witcher, still uncertain how I feel.
Kevin.
Hi, CreepyNuncleKevin on the forums. I definitely read The Witcher.
That's a
ouch.
What a great opening. I have read this. Bing.
This is Shoeshiner on the forums. Definitely a fanatic of The Witcher.
Yes, join us, Bing. David.
Hi, DavidHHH on the forums. I've been thinking about reading it or watching it or playing it for a while, and, well, since we're all at home and have lots of time, or at least many of us are, I jumped in so I could join this podcast and just started reading a few days ago and read most of it like hours ago.
And Marie.
Hi, yes, Marie, it's Nymeria on the forums, and I also have read it, which is a good thing. I'm not so sure myself about how I feel about it, and fair warning, there will be maybe French words and names because I've read it in French, and the names have nothing in common, so this is going to be hard.
I'm really eager to hear the differences.
Well, there's mainly one, but...
Is it Jaskier?
Is Dandelion's
Jaskier?
name?
Yeah,
No,
it is.
Yeah, okay.
Okay.
It is.
We're going to get all the names messed up.
How do you know the name in French, though?
Because that's the Polish name as
Yeah.
well.
Okay.
That's the Polish name.
Oh, wait, they use the Polish name? They use the Polish name in French and not the French word for dandelion?
Yes, and because I was
Yes.
like, well, but I know what a dandelion is, and it's not that, so
No,
why?
Technically,
Yeah.
in this world, I think
Dandelion.
it's pronounced Dandelion.
Wait, how do
I
they,
was wondering that.
How do they spell it in French, though?
What?
Like
Just
Jaskier. Oh, they do it with a J sound, not the
Yeah.
Y sound. I am intrigued.
So,
Yeah, I think the
Yeah.
Polish is Jaskier.
well, yeah, that's the original. Dandelion is the English fabrication.
Well, if it's an English fabrication, then it probably is pronounced dandelion, right? Because if it was Dandelion, why would, that's like a translation.
Well,
it would
yeah.
pronounce differently.
I don't know
the-
where.
In the audiobook, the guy who
Dandelion
reads
just
it-
sounds in English way less stupid than dandelion.
I like them both. As I was reading it, I kept going back and forth.
Yeah, I
Anyway,
wish they had kept Jaskier, but whatever.
That's
Yeah,
just in the
same.
TV show.
And now I'm all confused because I like the character a lot, and he's very important, so you have to call him. two
Wait,
different
okay,
things.
hold on, real quick. Are we establishing this is a no TV show spoilers though? Because I haven't seen it, and if
I
it
have.
is spoilers for a TV show, I
Yeah.
will hop off this cast.
okay.
That's the
Yeah.
extent of me going to a TV
I mean-
show. It's mentioning his name. That's it.
I'd say this. I think it's okay to say they did it better in the show, or like basic things like this is in the first season, this isn't, but like no spoilers.
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
fine.
agreed.
Translation, pronunciation, stuff like that's okay, I think.
However, I will bitch about how Full Test isn't sexy in the show, even though he is specifically described as beautiful in the books. But
Okay.
that is my biggest gripe.
You mean Burger King?
Yes,
What?
the
I
Burger
have no
King.
idea who we're talking about
Right,
anyway,
me
so...
either.
That's fine.
Anyway, all right. To get started, how about we just each kind of, I guess some of us already have said, but how did you first kind of hear about The Witcher? And also, what would you say is your favorite short story in the collection, of this collection? We'll get to the second collection next time. I guess I'll go first just to keep things going. I got into The Witcher because of the video games. I had heard great praise of them, and CD Projekt Red. They do some great video games with fantastic voice acting. The soundtrack, like all the music for it, is a very Eastern European style and sounds just very different from what I'm usually used to, and it's just a very nice atmosphere. And the characters in the video games are just very good. And so then when I found out, oh, this is actually a very popular series outside of America, I'm like, oh, well, I guess I'll give this a look. And I ended up reading them about 4 years ago when I started college, and yeah, I just fell in love with them. it adds so much lore to the world that I'm a lore junkie. So as soon as I find a fantastical world to get attached to, I latch on and don't let go. When my favorite story in this collection, is actually, I'll come back. Actually, no, it is A Question of Price is my favorite story in this one.
I started watching the show because everybody was like, it's so good, it's so good. And like, I enjoyed the show, but I don't think the show is very good. I was not intending on picking up the books and like actually had the thought like, I'm not going to read those. If they were really good, they would have been famous in America already. So I'm an asshole. I had some free Audible credits, so I got the books. I will say, I think like a lot of people on the cast, I wasn't like hardcore sold after The Last Wish. The Last Wish is about establishing the relationships and establishing a lot of the characters in the fact that like they exist and a lot of the concepts of the world, and things really kind of take off once Sapkowski can start using those. I sped through the series except for a couple of like mental health breaks because it was getting too intense for me. Paul was my therapist through this process / tormentor. Yeah, no, so it was just I found it really wonderful to dive into such a great fantasy world, but didn't feel like writing fantasy is very hard. So like no shade to any other authors, but like there is sometimes a sense of like effort. You can feel the author actively doing like the world building or the, name dropping of characters. And like, I just felt this was very seamless and natural. And once you get to really enjoy the characters, they're just unbelievably wonderful and complicated and very lovable. And the books are very different in certain ways from, I guess, what you would expect typical fantasy to be. Now I found myself here. I'm a Witcher stan. My favorite short story in this one, I actually think The Witcher might be like structurally one of the strongest, but certainly A Question of Price is the most like feminist appropriate story. Calanthe is just like a boss. And then I also really like The Last Wish because that has a lot of really cool implications for the future, and it has Dandelion and Yennefer.
Okay, why don't I jump in then? So I've obviously heard about them forever. I mean, everyone knows about the video games. I've enjoyed it. It was interesting when I started, like the first story or two, I was like really skeptical as I was going in because it seemed really, I don't know, a little too like almost a video gamey, like, ooh, here's like a list of enemies, and there were so many different names and monsters thrown at you in the first couple of stories at once that I had trouble paying attention. I just kind of was glazing over a lot of it, I thought. And the characters seemed kind of generic in the first story or two, to me at least. But as it went on, I liked the twists that the stories had, and and I think I was like fully on board with, I guess since we asked our favorite story, with once we got to A Question of Price, I was definitely on board. I really liked that one a lot. I'm not sure if I would put that or Last Wish is my favorite, but they were both really good. I feel like Last Wish makes for a great like season finale. You can see like the big huge battles being the like the whole big last like 10 minutes of the season. But all in all, I enjoyed it. I'm willing to come back to it. So there's that.
Yeah, for me, I guess it's the same as with most of you guys. It was actually in my on my to read list for a while, just because it's indeed more famous in Europe than it is in the UK. So I knew about this book. But the show, which I didn't watch, made me buy it, and I was like, okay, now I'm gonna read them so that I can watch the show afterwards, because that's what I do. I'm reading them in French because when you have to choose in translation anyway, because I'm not gonna read them in Polish, might as well use your first language. I find the writing a bit weird. I think that's the main reason why I'm not entirely convinced yet. But it's also because I'm not a huge fan of short stories in general. But I did like the stories, and I'm into the second book now, and it is getting better. So I'm gonna keep reading. And I guess my favorite story would be maybe The Lesser Evil, which establishes a lot of things regarding this world and our main character. And and thanks, Paul, for making us all read this book.
Yep.
Look, I'm just the drug dealer. The first hit is free.
There you
You guys got to do the rest.
So
Bing.
yeah, Paul didn't really introduce me to this drug because I was long past that point by the time
Take
I
this.
was. Yeah, no. I've long been. I've taken the drug, done the rehab, and I'm back in it. So, I first heard about the series back in 2008, I think, when the first game first came out. My roommate was playing the first game and he said it was great. I didn't actually like the first game very much, but it was the second game that actually played and hooked me. And I also started reading the books at back then. So that was, I think, 2012, 2013. Since then, I've played a third game, although I don't know if I actually finished the entire game yet. And I've watched the TV show. This is my third or fourth reread of all the books. And it's actually fun for me in the rereads to actually pick out the small details which I didn't realize was there. That's actually now in the games as well, and also were put into a TV show. This or that. So my favorite story out of all of these is the Question of Price. Still out of all the Witcher, even the ones that's going to come, because not only is the story itself, I think, great, but also sets up so much for what's going to come, and it also contains a genesis of my favorite character in the books.
So, how did I get into it? That's the first question. I played The Witcher 3 a long time ago, probably 4 or 5 years ago, and that was a lot. That was a tough place to jump in. For the most part, kind of hadn't thought much about it until the Netflix series. I actually just watched that probably 2 or 3 weeks ago, which, for reference, is about 4 months after it came out. Saw the call to arms and decided to make this happen. So I didn't find it organically or anything, I guess, is the story for me. As far as overall feelings, there were definitely parts that I enjoyed, that I thought flowed and had good characters. There were parts that I thought drug, and I guess too, I'm not a huge reader of fantasy outside of A Song of Ice and Fire. So for the most part, most of the time when I read it, I maybe have impossible standards in terms of character depth, and I think I had to adjust my settings a little bit and started liking it better. My favorite story on it was probably The Witcher. It's kind of simple, self-contained, but I think it does a really good job sort of establishing Geralt's approach to the world, his sort of opinions on how he does his job, and his personal code. I think it's a very good show, not tell example of that.
All right. And Abby.
All right, so flashback to a young Abby 4 months ago in Poland, seeing all of these signs for some weird show in Polish, being like, what is this? What's happening? Someone's like, oh, this is The Witcher. They're making a show. And I was like, oh, that's a video game. I don't play video games that aren't Pokemon or Nintendo. So I was like, whatever. Then the show comes out and my roommate watches it and she's like, wow, it's really good. And I'm like, wow. And she's like, there's also books. And I'm like, wow, this is the first time in my life where I actually have the opportunity to read the book before I see the piece of media, because it's very new. So I will not know anything about it. This is wonderful. So then I was like, I will read these books one day, but that day would not be soon because I'm a big procrastinator on everything. But then I saw a CTA and I was like, okay, frick, I need to get these books. And then also my school closed and they were like, you have 2 weeks of no school. So I was like, all right, okay, now I have time to read these books. Then I went and got the book and I read it, and I finished reading it like 30 minutes ago and was not very much of a fan. I think there's way too much dialogue and way too much exposition being just like shoved at you through dialogue. And also, I'm not sure if this is like a translation thing or not, but like I have like a lot of issues with the wording, the word choices used, because it just seems like they speak really modern and it's kind of strange for the setting that they're in. Also, though, I'm not like super into fantasy beyond A Song of Ice and Fire and like Harry Potter, so I'm not very familiar with a lot of fantasy things. So maybe this is just me being like, I need these archaicisms in there or whatever. But I thought it was like interesting. I definitely liked when Dandelion got introduced because he was fun. And like before that, I was kind of like, all these characters are kind of boring. Yeah. Like Geralt, he is a piece of white bread. And like I understand, I was like, okay, he's like a video game main character, so he has to just kind of be like like some sourdough bread over here. My favorite short story, I guess, I don't really remember, like, none of them really, like, stuck out to me, except for I really liked A Grain of Truth, but that's only because Geralt had the best zinger in it. Like, I had to get a sticky note and, like, mark it because it was so amazing. And when I give my chapter summary, you will all know this amazing zinger. It was so wonderful. I loved it so much.
I mean, The Last Wish is some of Sapkowski's first, like, actual work. Like, he didn't really set out to be an author. Like, he went to college for economics, and you can see some of that in his later writings. But, like, he definitely develops with time, and he certainly gets better. I would say, like, The Last Wish contains some of his weaker work simply because a lot of it's just his first work. But at the same time, a lot can be kind of drawn in. So let me just kind of give a setting for those listening who don't really know too much about the Witcher universe. The Witcher universe takes place on a place simply called the Continent, and it is originally home to dwarves and gnomes, and elves and later humans have entered into it from other worlds. Humans are implied to have come from Earth. However, monsters have also entered the world from more dangerous realms during a conjunction of the spheres. As early humans had not yet built cities or walls, they needed protection from the beasts. Thus, humanity's sorcerers came up with the Witchers. Humans mutated for greater strength, speed, and stamina than your average human. Trained from childhood in the ways of swordsmanship, alchemy, and minor magic, Witchers travel about from town to town, acting sort of as exterminators for dangerous monsters, as well as low-grade handymen for breaking curses as well. However, by now, much of humanity holds a bias against Witchers, viewing them as heartless mutants who will do anything for money. A Witcher is only ever loved by a town until he gives them his required price to rid them of the beast, and is often chased off afterwards, sometimes even without being paid. The Witcher books follow Geralt of Rivia, a wholly unusual Witcher, in that he is often pulled into more things than what his trade and nature usually allow. And with the Last Wish and Storm of Swords collections of short stories, they kind of are used as setting the stage for what the world is what the world is that we see in the books, and essentially acts sort of as a prologue as to the actual main series, which starts with Blood of Elves.
Storm of
But yeah.
Swords? Sorry.
Did I say Storm of Swords?
You did.
Fuck.
You definitely
Sword
did.
of Destiny.
I had to.
Sword of
Sword of
Destiny, yeah.
Sorry.
Let's
Yeah,
talk
that-
about
I
conjunction
didn't know
of the
if I should
spheres.
butt in or not.
As I was like, what a coincidence.
What are you talking about? I was bringing up my
Sorry.
Witcher Song of Ice and Fire fan fiction I'm working on.
Sorry to interrupt, but I had to.
All right. Let's start off with the first short story in the book, The Witcher. So, Kevin?
Yes, The Witcher. Here's my painstakingly prepared recap from the wiki.
Right.
I await with bated breath.
Geralt meets with the king of Nymeria, Foltest, to cure the king's daughter, born from an incestuous, scandalous union with his late sister, of a curse that transformed her into a monstrous Striga, who now terrorizes the town for a valuable reward. Foltest insists that Geralt not harm his daughter turned Striga, but soon allows Geralt to kill the Striga if Geralt decides that she cannot be cured back to her human form. Geralt spends the night at the old palace, which houses the Striga. Lord Ostrit, a magnate from Novigrad, arrives and tries to bribe Geralt into running away. Ostrit wants to use the Striga situation as proof of Foltest's inability to rule, convincing the inhabitants to support Novigrad's rule of Nymeria over Foltest's. That's a hard possessive to do. Foltest's. Geralt refuses and knocks out Ostrit to use him as bait for the Striga. Geralt fights with the Striga and soon overcomes her, despite the Striga's resistance to silver, which normally easily defeats monsters. In the morning, Geralt incorrectly believes the Striga has returned to a human and is severely wounded before the Striga finally becomes a young girl again. Geralt binds his wounds and faints, having earned his reward.
This is a very basic story in its opening. Just kind of sets the tone for what you imagine like the average Witcher job might be. You get hired by someone to break a curse or kill a monster, sometimes both. And it just also kind of shows Geralt as the consummate professional in his everyday work.
I just felt he was boring as fuck in this story. I'm sorry. I was like, is this our hero? Like, everyone talks about what a great badass he is and how what a wise ass he is and all that stuff online. And I was like, if this is all we're getting, I don't think I'm going to make it through the book. And luckily he got better. So, and the story itself, I thought was really generic fantasy.
It's very different coming into this knowing what a character Geralt is already. Because I felt when I read it, I already sort of have an established picture of what Geralt is, having played Witcher 2. So coming into it, I actually felt like this is a fun Monster of the Week time. It's very charming that way in comparison to what the video games are. So when you're coming in for a different approach, the very first impression can be a little rough.
Yeah, I had some issues with this chapter, but like I think in retrospect, I probably liked it more than the other ones because so first of all, I assume a Striga is something that's like specifically made up to this book, but I was like, the way it was described, I just had no way to picture it in my head.
Yeah,
I was so
I went right to Google.
Yeah, me too. But then also there's just like, something with, I think it's just something with the writing style, but there's a lot of things that like he tries to like show, not tell, but then it ends up me being just really confused about what the heck is happening. So when he was, I read this chapter a really long time ago, so I don't exactly remember my feelings towards it, but I just remember when he was like fighting with the Striga, I was so confused what was going on for like half the time. And maybe it's because I'm not like a close enough reader or something, but it was just something that I noticed throughout the book. Is just like I was constantly like, wait, what is happening? Like I understand that you don't want to tell us exactly what's going on, but I was like, what like this becomes more of a problem later. There was literally one chapter where I had to look up a plot synopsis because I was like, what is going on? Like, am I reading this correctly? But this chapter, I guess I definitely in retrospect liked it more than a lot of the other chapters, just because it did tell a story that like kind of seemed to make more sense than a lot of the other stories, because it did feel like he came to do a job and he did his job, where a lot of them it was like, oh, maybe he's going to do a job, but we don't really know, like I don't know. But sorry, I'm sorry, I'm very negative right now.
The thing about Sapkowski is that he, especially in these early stories, he dodges trying to describe in more detail sort of the more action scenes.
Yeah.
So he is. I feel like he's much better at actually sort of the more in more dialogue heavy scenes, in more illustrating characters. And often what I do is I just substitute what's going on in the video games into those scenes now. This is the problem I have coming into these books from the second game, and now having played the third game as well. I just substitute what's going on in video games into these action scenes. It's very different from somebody who's just reading it for the first time you approach the series.
I watched the show before I read the books, so it actually did help in a lot of ways, in that like I was more familiar with like this story is in the first season, and I didn't have to track everything and like decode as much. But I do really like the way he kind of just like tosses you in the deep end, and like it's where's Rivia? Dunno. What's a Witcher?
Yeah.
Like we'll get some kind of explanation of that, but like I do think that the confusing stuff comes more from the politics than the mechanisms of like the Witcher stuff. The story was like written in 1986, so I think it's like pretty audacious to like, just be like, here's my debut fantasy story, and it's like super incesty, and like I'm not actually like gonna comment particularly on that,
Yeah. Can I ask a quick question? Maybe for Paul or Bing, since you're more the experts. Like, in terms of, in what order were these stories written in terms of based on each other and the other series, the other books? Because maybe that'll help in our discussion. Because, like, for instance, if something's the very first thing he ever wrote, then it makes sense that he hasn't, like, fleshed certain things out. Because I know these were all, like, gathered from other stuff he'd written for other, like, from other, like, anthologies and stuff.
Order-wise, there's not too much of a specific order that the short stories take. Specifically with this one, I think the only thing that really matters is that The Witcher and by proxy, The Voice of Reason, both take place, like The Voice of Reason takes place almost immediately after The Witcher, And
Yeah.
by then, the voice of reason kind of seeps in like stuff from The Last Wish, because he mentioned Yennefer and stuff like that.
I get that, but that's not what I was more referring to is in terms of like how he wrote them. Does anyone know, like, for instance, was The Witcher the very first one he did, or was the Last Wish the first one, or did they come after a few of the novels or stuff like that? Just so we can have a sense of like how he was building, because I mean, like, for instance, in the Game of Thrones book, a lot of the stuff, he hasn't done a lot of the world building yet. So sorry.
I know for sure The Witcher was his first story that he submitted to a magazine. Bing, do you know?
1986.
1986.
It won third place.
Yeah, it didn't even win the first place.
So the first one is The Witcher. And then came actually a story that's in another. So The Road with No Return. Is that in Sword of Destiny, or is that in Something Begins? Actually, and then follow some of these stories in here and some of the stories in the Sword of Destiny. I don't know I don't know quite the time frame between like some of the other stories in here.
But most of these were written before the novels.
Yeah.
Okay,
yes.
Just curious because I wasn't sure.
Yeah.
Thank you.
But The Witcher is definitely the very first one.
And it seems it, but
Yeah, I don't know if The Road with No Return is actually in one of the collections of books.
Yeah,
I think it might be like a standalone.
I don't think I've read that one, so he has like a million short stories. Like every time I think I have a grasp on it, somebody from Poland is like, "Have you read this one?" And I'm like, "No, I didn't know that existed."
Yeah, it's one of it's the early years of fantasy publishing, the early times of fantasy publishing, where where a lot of this is still sort of serialized in magazines and stuff like that. And so, again, at this time, he wasn't thinking about constructing a coherent story, which
is why we have the like memory harp sound that basically is the entirety of the voice of reason.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Yeah, there's not too much to say about The Witcher. It certainly sets the world up. You see the kingdom of Nymeria and Foltest the King, who they play a greater role in the books and later video games.
Good, because I liked him somehow.
Yes. He comes off as a very selfish king, but a good man.
Yeah.
There's elements of Robert Baratheon in there. If Robert Baratheon stayed sexy, and,
unlike in a TV show,
and had a sister,
did marry Cersei, like
yeah.
if he just stayed single as a bad king, like. And you do see he actually really does want to know his daughter. He wants to be her father.
Mm-hmm.
And like he's like, this is my child. So, and I believe I'm probably copying off Michal's other podcast where she talked about The Witcher. But you really do see the fact that we don't really know if his sister loved him back or if she was just kind of there. Yeah, she's not present she's dead. It's the dead lady syndrome. But you do, at least to his credit, see that he legitimately wants his daughter. And like, of course, people can be like, oh, it's because he also needs an heir. But I don't think, like, if he need an heir, he could marry anyone he wants.
She didn't become his heir.
No spoilers for people.
Sorry,
it's
not important.
The games.
It's not important.
Yeah.
There are easier and more pleasant ways of acquiring an heir, I think, than
other than turning a monster into your daughter.
And it's pointed out in these books that women typically don't become heirs, anyways.
Yeah. So I think it very much comes down to maybe not the best king, but at least a decent dad.
Well, it's interesting. He's like a decent dad. I don't know if he's like a good person, because he is at the same time being like, yeah, I guess a bunch of people have been killed over the years. Like,
wow. It's also the fact that he's the king. I don't think he could be too connected with the peasantry.
Yeah.
And it is usually like the peasants who get killed by the monster.
Right.
See, that reminded me of that that Lord Farquaad quote where he's like, "Some of you will die, and I'm prepared to make that sacrifice."
Yes.
So,
oh god, now I'm picturing Foltest as Lord Farquaad. Don't like that. He's not sexy. Anyway.
Yeah, I think kind of the moral judgment of Foltest maybe changes in 2020 versus 1986.
Mhm.
I think even 10 or 15 years ago in my life, I probably would have agreed and looked more at, well, he's trying to be a good dad. He cares about his daughter. And I think the story is meant to highlight that, but nowadays it's hard to read a story like this where they just casually mention all the peasants that she's killed and all the various people she's killed. And it's not just people who are coming to try to deal with her. It's she's going out and hunting people. And it's hard not to read that and then just get furious with the leader who would let that keep happening because, on this faint hope that she gets saved. And then it does work out, which, it's like if you have a plan to win the lottery, you didn't really have a plan. But then I guess if you do, you look smart. But
All right, tinfoil, but maybe because this was like when did Poland become free of communist like Soviet rule? I don't remember, but it was like sometime in the 80s.
1990.
Okay, well maybe this is a commentary that is anti-Soviet, like anti-communist, being like, we are gonna make these capitalist feudal lords seem like the good guy.
Alas,
well, actually,
was...
Abby, like I think that's I don't know so much about
we'll
this
get to
story,
that with
but there is
Nilfgaard.
a lot of stuff in general in the story in the Witcher books that like I'm like, oh, he's definitely talking shit about Russia right now, like for sure.
We'll get to Nilfgaard.
Yeah.
Yep.
But I agree. I think that's interesting, Kevin, because it definitely does change. But I think that just kind of makes Foltest like a complicated character, right? Because like I do think he's a good father. I don't know that he was a good partner to his sister. I don't know that he's a just king. Like it does take kind of a lot of gall to be like, oh well, build me a new palace. This one has my monster daughter in it.
That is kind of ridiculous. It's like, oh, time to move. There's a monster in this one.
Yeah. It's very, like, that's not really highlighted, but to me, it strikes me as, like, so decadent and just, like, like, you imagine, like, the Real Housewives of somewhere just being like, ew, like, the sink broke, or moving,
When there are, like, the meetings between the monarchs in later books, it does kind of feel like the Real Housewives at different points.
I was more bothered that they said he built the palace in 7 years. Like, there's no way, unless a sorcerer helped them or something, that another castle would be built in 7 years with that technology.
Well, there are dwarves in this world, and I don't know. There could be fantasy elements. He could have his court sorcerers do some help, but yeah. That is kind of... the peasants never have a good existence in any of these fantasy books, do they?
No, but that does become a theme also.
Would they?
Like helpless people.
They should have thought of that before they became peasants. Anyway.
Wait, where's that from?
It's from Emperor's New Groove, the famous fantasy novel.
Oh god, I need to rewatch that.
Cult classic.
Oh god. All right. Anyone else have anything to say about The Witcher? Next up is A Grain of Truth.
While traveling through a forest, Geralt comes across corpses with strange wounds. One corpse has a blue rose pinned on its dress. Tracing the path the corpses came from, the Witcher arrives at a seemingly deserted mansion. Before entering the premises, he notices a woman in the forest line watching him. She runs away once Geralt notices. Geralt approaches the house and its owner. A large bear-like beast named Nymeria attempts to scare him away, to no avail. Nymeria allows Geralt to enter the house, which supernaturally obeys Nivellen's every command. Nymeria discusses how at one point he was a human who raped a priestess at a religious temple, who cursed him to be a beast until certain conditions were fulfilled. But Nymeria could not remember what those conditions were. Returning to the mansion, his family home, he attempted to entertain relationships with daughters of merchants to help cure his curse, but none seemed to help. Before departing, Geralt warns Nymeria that his newest relationship, named Verena, may actually be a monster. Nymeria insists that he and Verena are truly in love and is now hesitant to break his curse. Geralt notices his horse acting strangely but dismisses it and leaves. Along the road, Geralt realizes why his horse acted strangely and returns to the mansion. He's greeted by Verena, who Geralt identifies as a Bruxa, a vampire-like monster with telepathic abilities. A fight ensues. The Bruxa overwhelms Geralt, but Nymeria joins the fray and impales the monster on a pole. The Bruxa confesses her love for Nymeria telepathically just before Geralt finally kills her. The confession breaks Nivellen's curse and he returns to normal. within all of the story, Geralt makes the most savage inner monologue ever. I'm just going to read this paragraph. It's 2 sentences. I promise you it will be worth it. So, on page 56, when Nivellen is like, "This is what I used to look like," the line is, "Beneath the dust and spiderwebs, a nondescript man with a bloated, sad, spotty face and watery eyes looked down from the painting. Geralt, who was no stranger to the way portrait painters tended to flatter their clients, nodded." The end. That was so savage.
I like the twists though. Like, I mean, most of these stories have a big twist in the middle. I like the fact that oh, it's a monster, and hey, come on in for tea and cookies. and then like the monster's the good guy. Like, it wasn't what you expect from a fantasy story, so I kind of like that.
Yeah, air
really
quotes around good guy.
Well, yeah.
It's very
I
like
really wanted them to fly off in the end, like in La Belle et la Bête from the 1950s. That would have been the best.
I just keep getting hung up on the fact that it's like, man, I had to rape her.
Yeah. I mean, that's part sucks.
And like it's kind of like, oh well, he's a nice guy.
Yeah. You're right. I retract that.
Mean, the story doesn't ask you to interrogate that for sure, but like to me that was just like, blah, 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 blah. Wait, you're blaming the priestess? Like this was a bad temple? Like is that the problem here? Like,
and that's definitely how he writes it.
Oh.
That's definitely how he writes it, because I know when I was reading it at the time, I was like, oh, ew. Now, then when I thought about it afterwards, I was like, oh, yeah, he was sweet.
But I think that for a retelling of Beauty and the Beast, it is an interesting choice to make, and I think that it's actually more fitting for the actual like moral behind the Beauty and the Beast on the princess part, where like, because in the Disney version, and I actually think in the original, I don't remember, it's been years since I've watched that, the reason he turns into a beast is because he's just kind of an asshole, and like he has to grow from that in some way. But like in this version, like he's actually kind of like a piece of shit, and he doesn't have the maturity to see that he is making these decisions for himself, and like he's like, no, I was forced to do it, like they would have thought I was weak, yada yada yada. And so by becoming this beastly monster, he's forced to like tackle with his like himself, and we do see that he has grown as a person. And I'm not saying like it's okay that he raped this woman and he grew from it, but I do think that it because like the brutality of women should not be used for like character growth, but I do think that is a better option than just like what we're used to in this kind of fairy tale growth. That sounds horrible what I just said, but I hope that you don't misinterpret what I'm trying to say.
On the other hand, I feel like in Beauty and the Beast, I mean, in this story, he did something awful long ago, but he does grow. Whereas in Beauty and the Beast, what he did was he was kind of like rude to a guest. Whereas then he freaking kidnaps Belle's father and then holds her hostage. I mean, he gets worse. He eventually like gets better when he falls in love with her. I mean, Beauty and the Beast is just Stockholm Syndrome, the movie, right?
I think he does improve from the person in general, and like, that he he's more confident. Like, I guess I don't really object to what he does with these girls, like, because I have to take him at his word that like when they do sleep with him, it's their choice and all that. But I don't think there's any reckoning within the story that like, maybe you shouldn't have raped that priestess. Like, I don't think that is something that either Geralt or Nivellen consider.
So this is something that I think Sapkowski, especially in the early stories, he has a bad tendency to try to like put his own twist on classic fairy tales. Obviously, this is, we've mentioned many times before, this is Beauty and the Beast. And he's trying to figure out ways to sort of, what is my angle into this story? What is my contribution to sort of into this sort of very familiar fairy tale, but adding a twist to it? And I don't think he at this point in time in his writing career, he hasn't really considered the sort of delicacy of sort of the subject matter he's wading into. Kind of like how in the first story he didn't consider the potential questions that incest could lead into. And I think later on he's much more delicate in handling potentially controversial issues.
I mean, even question of price. I was getting real sick of some of the women stuff in this book when I was reading it, and then we got to a question of price, and I was like, whoa,
yeah. Agency.
Okay.
Wow.
My criticisms of his work, I think, are definitely in the moment, and I think they're valid because this is the story.
No, absolutely.
I'm glad I didn't stop at this and
Yeah.
and think that was the whole arc of himself as a writer of female characters.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Personally, I think this is one of his weakest.
And you see throughout the books, he does take elements of fairy tales and pulls a little dark spin on them. Like, hey, it's not a happily ever after, yada, yada, yada. This one, though, was the most over the head one. Like, he beats you with it. He's like, yeah, it's Beauty and the Beast. Get it? He's wearing a doublet and stuff, and he's a big monster. And
It's
His
way
house
Prominence.
is magic.
his house is magic and everything. But
Yeah.
while in some of the later short stories and the actual books, it's a lot more subtle. And yeah, you still get like Renfrey is Snow White and so forth. It's all
Question of
very
price is
subtle.
Cinderella.
Yeah, and it's all just very kind of more his own than the actual fairy tale. I think he just tried too hard with this one. And again, what Michal said, maybe raping the priest, like, could have been murder. Murder would have been fine, but yeah.
Well, it's just so weird. It's like, and then she killed herself like a Gaul, and I'm just like, what? What is going on?
Yes, despite you, of course.
Yeah, and it's also the second story in a row where like basically the women have no voices at all, and like
Yeah.
I guess technically what does she turn out to be, the Bruxa? She does have some things to say, but they're not
But she's the
especially
monster.
profound.
Like, she's supposed to be the real monster, and
Yeah.
so
I mean, to be fair, female of Bruxas tend to be intelligent.
They are. I've played the games. All right. Going from a grain of truth, we're going to the lesser evil.
On the eve of a market festival, Geralt rides into the town of Blaviken with a monster carcass in tow. He seeks out Caldemain, the town's alderman, to try to get a reward for killing the monster. Caldemain refuses, but one of his guards mentions that the town wizard might find value in it. They head to the wizard's tower, who is uninterested in the carcass but wants to meet Geralt nonetheless alone. Geralt steps into the tower and discovers the wizard is Stregobor, a mage he has met previously. Stregobor, or however you pronounce it, explains why he is in hiding and why he wished to meet with Geralt. A young, supposedly cursed woman wants to assassinate him, and Stregobor wants Geralt's protection. Geralt refuses in disbelief and leaves. Meanwhile, the described assassin named Renfrey has entered Blaviken along with her band of mercenaries. Geralt meets her in a local tavern, and she explains to Geralt and Caldemain that she bears a letter from a king that she is under his protection, which Caldemain confirms. That night, when Geralt withdraws to his attic room at Caldemain's home, he finds Renfrey. Renfrey explains that Stregobor has previously tried to kill her for no reason other than a superstition, and encourages the Witcher to kill Stregobor instead. Geralt again refuses and pleads with Renfrey to forgive Stregobor to prove the superstition wrong. Renfrey refuses, but implies she will leave town peaceably before spending the night with Geralt. In the morning, on the day of the market festival, Geralt realizes that Renfrey lied and won't be leaving town, but will in fact massacre the people of Blaviken to draw Stregobor out of his tower. Bummer. Geralt races to the marketplace and finds Renfrey's mercenaries. Although they show no immediate indication of causing harm in the market, Geralt attacks and swiftly kills each mercenary. When Renfrey arrives, Geralt defeats her as well. After the fight, Stregobor approaches the Witcher, intent on performing an autopsy on Renfrey's body to prove that the curse had physically affected her. Geralt refuses to let him touch her body. Stregobor leaves, and the townsfolk, believing Geralt had just murdered a group of innocent men during the festival, begin hurling rocks at the Witcher. Geralt protects himself with magic until Caldemain tells the villagers to stop, but demands Geralt leave Blaviken and never return. Geralt's actions have now earned him the nickname the Butcher of Blaviken.
All right. And with this story is kind of our first concept of Geralt's inner struggle consistently to not get involved before he is inevitably pulled in to get involved, and thus earning the name of the Butcher of Blaviken, which kind of follows him throughout the rest of his life.
In my brain, when like Renfrey was introduced, I had heavy rock music playing, and I like picture her like walking. I don't know, like it was so over the top. Her like mercenary gear, they're just so like badass and stuff, and I thought it was pretty funny.
I think this is a really weird story to me, but like it definitely has some really interesting things in it. Like it's the, like I mentioned, it's the first time like we actually get a female character really speaking for herself. And that remains kind of like the ambiguity is very interesting to me. Like it's frustrating because you don't actually know, what Renfrey is, and is she really a monster? Is she really a mutant? Or just like a normal psychopath or whatever. The fact that Geralt has to like grapple with that ambiguity and not receive an answer and kind of like suffer for it anyway is a good entry into the rest of his struggle and his philosophy and his like ideas about choosing. And even in the rest of this book, like there's a lot of times when he is faced with that, with the idea of choosing, and he usually says he's not gonna, and then does.
The choosing thing was something that I also picked up on, and I just like, I don't know, maybe I'm just very negative or something, but like I was just like, why? Like I don't understand why he didn't just let her kill Stregobor. Like it seems like Geralt's like, I don't want to get involved. Like I don't know what's up. This guy's an asshole. Like there's so many things where it's like Geralt's like, oh, I don't want to, like, this is not my place to be involved. We see this also in the next story too, where he's like with the queen being like, oh, like I don't really, this isn't my place to be involved. I deal with monsters, yada yada yada. And like then he's like, oh, but I'm involved now. Whoopsie. There's nothing I could do to not be involved. Whoops.
But he can't really let her kill the wizard, because the only way for her to do that is to drive him out of his tower and murder everyone in the process. I think that's the whole point. He can't.
Well, her first offer was for like Geralt to like help her lure him out of the tower.
Yeah, but that's not letting her kill him. That's helping her kill him. And I get why that's not the same thing for Geralt.
To us, letting Stregobor die might actually be the lesser evil, like only one person dies. But again, we don't know for sure if Stregobor is guilty. Like, yeah, he's definitely an asshole. You find out a lot of magic users in this world are. Bad things have happened to Renfrey. She probably didn't deserve any of that. But at the same time, there's also the niggling doubt of the Curse of the Black Sun, where it's in the back of your mind, where you're like, well, is there a curse? Was she fated to turn out like this? Or was it the actions of these people that caused her to become like this? And does any of her past experiences excuse any of the bad stuff she's doing? It definitely gets into the deeper philosophical bits that the rest of the Witcher books kind of follow. And then you get Mopey Geralt, ultimate form. I think this story does a good job of kind of setting up later problems where he is dedicating himself to neutrality, or at least telling himself he's dedicating himself to neutrality, because I think he's learned a quote-unquote lesson from this.
Yeah, this story, I think, is very archetypical of what's going to many, many different stories that's coming up in The Witcher, in that you're presented with a choice, and often these choices are not just a good choice or the bad choice. It's often a shitty choice and another shitty choice.
Yeah.
And you're going in without perfect information, and you sort of just have to, you're not giving enough time to find out everything. You sort of just have to make a decision.
Every time I read the story, like I feel slightly differently about Renfrey and whether, what she actually is. Because there's that really interesting point where the narrator, like, she talks to the men, and Geralt's like, her voice was reminiscent of like blood and fire on steel and stuff like that. And then there's that super weird moment at the end where like he has like an out of body experience where he refuses to let Stregobor touch her. And I still don't really know what's going on there.
Geralt's background has a lot of similarities with Renfrey. His own personal background. They were both abandoned as children.
It's very ambiguous, but at the same time, like, Renfrey definitely gets her say, and she has almost like a Shylockish, like, I bleed if I'm pricked and all that. So I think this story is definitely like a step up in a lot of ways from the other stories in the collection, or the ones at least before now. Even though I still don't know what's going on in some of it.
Yeah, I felt like I was totally lost in this story, and I think part of it was I was not paying as much attention maybe as I should be because I just wasn't all that invested.
Because, I mean, it's really easy to miss the gambit or whatever that she says.
Oh, where, like, bandits kidnapped, like, a merchant caravan
Right.
and then killed the merchant.
Yeah, and that's, like, very... Because she mentions the Tridem ultimatum. Yeah. And, like, you don't know what that doesn't register. And it doesn't even really register the second time, I think.
Right.
So it's like, almost too subtle a little bit, even though he explains exactly what happens. But that is... I think that's really pivotal to understanding, you know, the story. And then, obviously, you get that kind of, like, sad-ish moment at the end where she's like, oh, it didn't work anyway. It wouldn't have worked. So maybe nobody was even really in danger. And, you know, all this was for nothing.
And you guys make a good point. Like the kind of world building Sapkowski does is sometimes very aggressive world building, where he just kind of throws things in as though you lived in the world yourself,
Right.
and you would know what a Tridem ultimatum might be. He does like do his best to kind of throw monologue to kind of explain things, but it's sort of an inverse of like Tolkien, who has like an entire first section that's like concerning hobbits. What is a hobbit? And it's like a beginner's manual to the Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, I mean, half that stuff you mentioned in your little summary of like the background here, like isn't anywhere in this book. Some of it is, but a lot of it isn't. I didn't know most of that.
All right. The next up is Question of Price.
The story begins with Geralt being groomed by the Castellan of the Kingdom of Sintra. He had been invited to take the seat right next to the Queen of Sintra, Calanthe, in a feast where she is about to meet potential suitors for her daughter Pavetta. Geralt is to pose as Sir Ravix of Forhorn. During the dinner, various different guests come in. Potential suitors include the Duke of Atra, as well as a contingent of people coming from the island of Skellige, led by Ice Tursak, as well as the actual suitor Crack on Crite. And also among this retinue from the islands of Skellige is the druid Mosesek, who throughout the feast has been throwing eyes at Geralt, pointing out that something weird's about to happen. So Geralt during the feast questions why Calanthe had wanted him in this feast, specifically wants him to be right next to her, and what is he doing in this feast in the first place. Calanthe hints that she's hiring him specifically for a good reason that pertains to his job of monster slaying, which he questions, given that this is a very political affair. It's known that Calanthe wants to marry her daughter to Crack on Crite or someone from Skellige to form an alliance with them, and that she wants Geralt there to ensure that happens. Eventually, why exactly him, a witcher, needs to be there was discovered when a weird knight shows up, a guy who claimed himself to be the Urchin of Erlenwald. So this guy claimed that 15 years ago he had saved the life of Calanthe's husband and Pavetta's father, King Rognar, when he was out hunting, and that after saving his life, he has asked King Rognar for a reward by invoking the so-called Law of Surprise, in which he is to have what Rognar has, but doesn't know that he has at that point in time. That promise would turn out to be Princess Pavetta, who Calanthe was pregnant with when Rognar was out hunting. Queen Calanthe refuses for him Urchin's demand for her daughter's hand, which led to a lot of discussions about promises and destiny and all that sort of stuff. But eventually, Calanthe forces Urchin of Erlenwald to remove his helmet, which discovers that his has the face of a monster. And chaos started.
With a hedgehog.
It looks like a hedgehog, yes. His Sonic, but like weird. Right. So eventually, a bunch of the other suitors started getting angry and started trying to attack Urchin. Geralt at that time started to get involved, but everything sort of gets halted when Pavetta starts screaming louder and louder, and suddenly her screams is causing all sorts of mayhem to break out and people being forced I don't know, their eardrums being destroyed and things getting blown up in the palace. Eventually, Geralt was able to team up with Mosasak, the druid, to finally force her to control her, to keep her power in check. Finally, when the ruckus has settled down, Geralt points out that it isn't actually up to Calanthi or even Urchin to decide how the situation is going to be resolved, but that the law of surprise specifically needs Pavetta herself to give approval. But Pavetta, it was discovered that Pavetta and and this Urchin, who's called by Pavetta as Dooney, that they've actually had already been seeing each other for a year, and that Pavetta that Pavetta actually is in love with him. So eventually, Queen Calanthi just accepts that Dooney and Pavetta will be married, and that she herself will marry Iced Turzak to establish that alliance with Skellige as she wants to happen. Dooney wants to thank Geralt for saving his life from the various guards and the Duke of Atra who tried to threaten him, as well as controlling Pavetta. But Geralt says, okay, well, I'll ask the same from you, what you asked from the king 15 years ago, that which you have, but you don't know. At exactly that time, they discovered that, well, turns out Pavetta's pregnant, so that her child in the future would be raised by Geralt as a Witcher.
Clearly, we're setting something up here.
Yes.
Yes. Pavetta is
Did I
pregnant.
miss that? Oh my god, I totally
Yes,
missed
you
that.
did.
Yes, you did. Very end of the story. And
I would say this is technically the beginning of the main series.
yes.
Yeah.
Very much a prologue in that.
It kind of can't be understated how important this story is to the rest of
Yes.
the
Yes.
The entire rest of the series hinges
On that last
On-
sentence or two.
on the
Yes.
law of surprise.
And Destiny. This is the first
and
time Destiny
Destiny.
becomes.
And Geralt becomes highly entwined with the royal family of Sintra and the child yet to be. I really enjoy this one, if only for Calanthi, who is... I always just imagine her as the Queen of Thorns, but if she was actually the queen. And she's just... sassy and like verbally jousting with Geralt the entire time. I also like this one because it gives us one of my favorite names ever, Kukudak, named because apparently he can sound like a rooster.
Yep.
This is from Wikipedia, but apparently that guy's name is Islandbird of Tig.
Islandbird of... And I prefer Kukudak.
Yeah.
Right.
And that's what stops Pavetta from screaming, because he attacks the bagpipes
yeah.
and then just
Yeah.
Right.
It's
Yeah.
very
Yeah,
Witcher.
noises.
It's like, oh no, it's not actually the mages and the Witcher who like managed to stop her. It's this guy making a lot of crazy noise with bagpipes.
Right. Yeah, it was weird.
Yeah, and you just have a lot of great names in this, because you meet the Islanders of Skellige, who are basically, imagine the Iron Islanders, but not assholes.
That's
Yeah.
what I felt like. I thought they were going there.
They're very Viking-esque.
Good.
You will see Croc on Crate.
Mhm.
Oh, good. Patrick will be happy.
And
That
Mouse is
series has a lot of Skellige in her.
Yes.
Yeah.
She spends a decent portion of her childhood on Skellige. You also like Ice Twirsech and Dragbong Du, and
Yeah.
you're just like, oh, where are you finding these great names, Andre? And even like the fake name for Geralt, Sir Lord Ravix of Forhorn,
Yeah,
is
that's terrific.
a great name. And
It's also I love his sigil, right?
Yeah.
Because it's like
A
a
maiden
maiden
on a
riding
bear.
a bear, which
Yeah.
is very, definitely tied into some of the,
Bear in the Maiden Affair.
and just the themes of the story, with Pavetta and the beast.
One thing I thought was interesting about this is that in some ways he does in this all the stuff I didn't like in the other books and the other stories, but I liked it here for some reason. Like there's way too many characters that I could not even remotely keep track of, but I didn't care because I liked them.
yeah.
This character's doing something and I wasn't really sure which one it was doing that, but I'm like, yeah, whatever, I'll go with it because I'm enjoying the rest of it, which is funny. And I will say I feel like everything was kind of way too neatly tied up. Like, oh wait, the queen isn't, he's not really the king, and oh wait, she was having an affair all along, oh wait, and so was the queen, oh, and she's pregnant, conveniently just in time for Geralt to claim the baby. And it was just like a lot of it seemed really, really convenient. But I
Too
don't care 'cause I
convenient,
enjoyed it.
probably.
Right. But I enjoyed
Yeah, you almost think something might be going on in the background.
it. So deliberately so. Either way, I didn't care because I enjoyed it.
Yeah.
I just have to I have very mixed feelings in a good way about Calanthe because she is like a real piece of work.
Yeah.
And there's some stuff about her in Sword of Destiny that is like, holy shit. But she's so dominant in this story and has so many like amazing lines, and like I can't even pick them all, but like, well, one thing Geralt says is like Geralt was amazed by her arsenal of smiles, which is just, I think, a fantastic line.
Mhm.
And then at the end, which I'm still going through because this is a long story.
I would say I just found a random line, but with Calanthe, I'll give you whatever you ask for, and I don't like being told to repeat myself. I wonder, Witcher, do you always try to dissuade your employers as strongly as you are me? Time is slipping away. Answer, yes or no. Yes, that's better. That's better, Geralt. Your answers are much closer to the ideal. They're becoming more like those I expect when I ask a question. So, discreetly stretch your left hand out and feel behind my throne. And it's like he's grabbing the sword she's placed there, but you tell, like, she's used to getting her way, and, like, as queen, she expects to be getting her way in all affairs.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. You know, this story really sets in motion all of the later events of the series, and that it starts with such a, like, it's so interesting because, you know, you don't really know what's going on and why Geralt's there and what he's doing, and then, like, what he is brought there for is definitely not what he ends up doing, and then whether or not that's, you know, a good or a bad thing kind of changes depending on how you look at it. And yeah, I don't know, it's really cool, and the fact that it ends on such a happy note is I think it's actually more of an artistic choice than it seems initially, is what I'll say.
And you know, for a fantasy story that's, you know, not all that recent, it's nice that, like, both of the major female characters have serious agency, and they decide what they're going to do with their lives in both cases, so that was kind of cool.
Yeah, because it's really disturbing to be like, oh, so this guy just asked for this, and, like, Pavetta, like, belongs to him now, and then the fact that Geralt, like, very clearly establishes that it's Pavetta's consent that, like, seals the deal, is a big relief.
Something more than destiny.
Yeah.
Which comes into play later. I would say of all the stories in this collection, that's the key one to watch. If not, that and The Last Wish, I think, are the necessary reads for you to really understand these things.
Yeah.
And it also gives a good show of how Geralt approaches sentient monsters. There are a lot of monsters who can understand they're not just beasts who are looking to eat, vampires and such, kind of with the Bruxa. And some, like, are malicious and pose a constant danger to people. But you do learn in this that Geralt is against killing a monster for simply because they are a monster. And for the fact that he also recognizes this isn't a natural monster, this is a curse. And what do witchers do? Well, they break curses. So that's just kind of his general, he's like, I'm not just going to kill this guy because he's cursed. And also, he doesn't really like being used by Calanthe.
No.
Again, she says, like, this, it's called a question of price, because so much of this is Calanthe being like, well, what will it cost? Because she's willing to pay, like, dividends to kill Dooney and have her Pavetta marry Crocon Crate. But we do see that despite just kind of a general stereotype of witchers being mercenaries in all regards, we do see that Geralt does kind of have his own Witcher's Codex. Now, whether or not his code changes over time depending on how he feels, that is open-ended.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that actually brings up an interesting question I had, which we're not going to completely get into the game now, but one thing I wanted to ask, though, is, since you brought it up there, which is, I mean, I like the idea of a more morally complex hero, and yet let's face it, video games are generally kill all the monsters you can. You get more points, you get more you get more experience, you get more whatever, more loot when you kill lots of monsters. So does that concept of like sentience, does that translate into the game well?
Absolutely. What makes The Witcher, well, especially Witcher 3 great, is that it's not like that in the video games, in that almost every single side quest has its own story that presents sort of a moral dilemma for Geralt. So yes, there's the sort of the loot collection aspect to that, but you're also sort of forced to sort of confront moral questions that there's not an easy answer to in almost every single side quest.
So basically, Geralt and so Dandelion are looking for work at the edge of the world, which I don't know where that is, but I didn't understand the geography of this whole thing. So they stumble into a weird situation where some kind of devil is doing mischief, and the villagers want Geralt to drive him away, but not kill him. So Geralt goes out to the fields and finds the devil, but it attacks him. So he goes back to the village, where he meets with the old wise woman and her kind of apprentice, whose name is Lil, and who is a weird character who you kind of understand is not quite who she appears to be. They learn that the devil is actually a Sylvan, and so he is an intelligent creature, and Geralt wouldn't kill him anyway. So he goes back out to the fields tries to talk to him to understand why he's doing this and to convince him to just stop. But they end up fighting, and as the Sylvan escapes, Geralt is knocked out by an unidentified rider. So he wakes up bound next to Dandelion, and there are elves talking with the Sylvan, whose name is Torque, apparently. It becomes clear that Torque was stealing food for the elves, who have been driven from their homes and are starving in the mountains because of the humans. So Geralt tries to convince the elves to let them go, but they won't, and they are preparing to kill them. That's when Lil comes in, but now she's the legendary queen of the fields. She communicates telepathically with the elves, and Geralt and Dandelion are allowed to leave with Torque after exchanging kind of farewells with the elves and a promise that they will find themselves on the field when there's finally a battle between the humans and the elves. And that's the end.
All right. So the question I was going to ask is, when the old wise woman speaks, does she speak in more like an archaic form of French?
Let me check. I'm not sure, but I have the book.
Because in English, she uses a lot of tis.
They went ham.
Like when she's reading, or not reading, but remembering what the book says. Though the witchman greatly covetous and greedy for gold be, giveth ye not such a one more than for a drowner 1 silver penny. It speaking like back when English sounded more like German in like the way it's formed.
Yeah.
With like the verbs going first.
No, it's not. Like, it's a bit more archaic than the rest of the wording, but not that much.
No.
Clearly not to the extent you're describing, but I have no idea what it is in Polish, so...
All right, so what did you guys think of The Edge of the World?
Yeah, just very quickly. So specifically the location is Doblafana, the former elvish kingdom that was mentioned by Philip Vendrell, which has by this point been taken over by humans. Mostly.
This is, I think, where the first time we get like him being like, I'm just gonna straight up rip off Tolkien, but like a little different, like but bad, like what if everybody really didn't get along, and then the situation had been reversed. I mean, Philip Vandrell seems to me like a name straight out of Tolkien, and
Teruviel.
Yeah, Teruviel.
But I think that the twist is that these elves don't act like Tolkien's elves. These are individuals. They're just as prone to very humanistic emotions, unlike the more sort of ethereal almost.
Yeah, I definitely feel like this is kind of what might have happened to the Tolkien elves if they
Sure.
didn't have a west to sail to.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
if Tolkien's elves had to stay in Middle-earth, things would have been like, you read the Silmarillion, some of those elves are real assholes. And you can imagine how they would just clash so much with humanity.
Mm-hmm.
Like, there's kind of the idea that they leave for a reason, right? They leave Middle-earth for a reason. And,
Yeah.
you know, if that was not able to happen, like the Age of Man descending, which is sort of what Geralt talks about. Like, it's, you know, things have changed, and now it's man time.
I think what's interesting about these elves specifically is how pathetic they are at this point.
Mm-hmm.
And that the senses that I get out of them is just general pity. And that's what Geralt felt towards them.
You know, one thing I thought was weird was the contrast and way almost too stark a contrast for me, where the very next story has elf major characters and they're completely different. Like, time-wise, do those two stories happen near each other, or are they just totally different elves? It was just weird to me.
They're the same elves, but in different locations. Like, there are some elves who refuse to integrate with human society, and they kind of become guerrilla groups with, like, dwarves and halflings included, called the Scoia'tael. You kind of learn more about them in the later books. But then you have, like, elves who just kind of live in cities, live in towns. They're still kind of treated like second-class citizens. Like because racism.
Yeah. Right.
But like, they still, like, depending on the town, like, some places are more inclusive and like, willing to be diverse compared to other places.
Well, that's sort of what, like, the complicated thing, right? That's what Geralt's arguing for. And you know, and, like, you know, you have to assimilate if you want to survive. And, you know, Phil Evangel's like, oh, so we should just go and be treated like second-class citizens and, like, be taxed and, you know, have, like, it was like very kind of like, you know, Jews in Europe to me. Like, there's, you know, mostly that role is taken by the dwarves, but, like, in this story it felt very like, you know, why should we bother becoming like everybody else? Like that just makes you more comfortable, you know, as opposed to, like, actually benefiting anyone.
No, I also got the very Jews in Europe, especially, like, obviously I don't know anything about the dwarves yet because I haven't read that far, like, read into other books, but I definitely got that with, like, even if they do assimilate, they're still different, and they're, like, never gonna be the same, because you have these elves that are assimilated, but, like, they're still different because they're elves, and you, like, and they're just, like, you just have this dichotomy, I guess. I saw that connection a lot too with the question of assimilation in Europe, especially Eastern Europe.
Another thing I also kind of like this one is how different they are from the Tolkien elves, in that the Tolkien elves are kind of treated as knowing everything. Meanwhile, like, the, like, Sylvan Torque is bringing them these seeds, and they're like, what do they call this seed? He's like, oh, it's flax. And, like, they don't know what, like, agriculture, like, you kind of get the feeling that elves were very much live off the land, while humans are reap what you take.
Yeah, now you feel like the elves are thousands of years ago when they actually ruled over these lands. The elves are just people who are basically like spoiled aristocrats, and by this point they have no idea how to survive on their own. They had to sort of leech off neighboring villages.
Or even just like the, you know, the kind of the downside of living magically in a way, right? I don't have any reason to doubt then that he was like, you know, the earth would just spring forth its gifts for us and you guys have to, like, hack at it and whatever, and we don't know how to do that. And it's like, well, if you don't know how to, like, but that's not working anymore, you know? So, like, you know, I mean, all the elves are like, well, we were here first, and then, like, the dwarves are like, no, and, like, checking their watches and being like, we got here, like, before you guys.
Dwarves and gnomes are like, this is our house. You came here.
See, I might have misinterpreted this, but I saw it as, like, the elves, when they said that, it was, like, more they were a foraging society, and then the humans are, like, a pastoralism, agricultural society. And so the elves, like, when they're saying, like, things just spring forward from the ground, like, it reminded me of this paper I had to read once for anthropology class on the Matsutake mushroom. I forget who wrote the paper, but it was talking about how, like, the people that forage for these mushrooms, they view it as like the earth is giving, it's like a more natural and like relationship with the world, and like the earth is giving them these things. And then when they come to the consumer, it was about consumerism and commodification of things. I'm not gonna get into the whole thing, but anyways, it's like a different relationship that you have with the item. And so like I saw it as the elves are saying, like, we were foraging and stuff, and it's just where they live happens to not grow anything that they can forage for, and that's the way that their culture runs. And so because they were forced out of this place that was so plentiful in like the way that they live their life and the type of society and structure they have, it's just like they no longer, it's kind of like in Canada when a bunch of I've probably brought this up a million times on all these casts. I talk about this all the time, I don't know why. Like a bunch of indigenous people were forced to, or not forced, but like kind of forced to move up north to like the very northern part of Nunavut, and like they might be hunter-gatherers, but they're not prepared to be like hunter-gatherers in that specific section of Canada, and so they weren't able to survive properly because that section didn't have like the resources that they were used to, so they didn't know how to use it. And so that's kind of how I interpreted this, but that might have been completely misinterpreted.
I feel like there were different types of elves. So people who like Philavandrel, who were elvish nobles before everything that happened, and people like the elf character that appears in the next story, his sort of from his lineage, in which there are elves who were able to sort of who probably did sort of live off the lands and gathered things and sort of worked for a living. And then you have people like Philavandrel who just have things given to him. So I think there is this sort of I think you're not wrong in some of your assumption. And I think Philavandrel is trying to generally invoked this sort of a lifestyle that no longer exists. But I think individually, people like Philavandrel, people like Toruvio, they're used to a lifestyle that's not available to them, and they're angry about that and not willing to adapt. Whereas there are elves who did adapt over time, and these are the people that those are the people that Geralt points to and say, why can't you be more like them? Now I think that generally there's this larger question of whether people like Philavandrel should feel like they need to adapt to this new world, and because that's where it gets to even further larger issues regarding race and cultural assimilation and these sort of larger issues. I feel it's interesting that this story try to get at all these themes, whereas the story itself is actually incredibly simple.
It really does an excellent job of kind of setting the scene of how elves are in this world, so that for future reference you can be like, oh, this is what Philavandrel was talking about, or this is what they're talking about when non-humans face discrimination in this now slowly growing human-centric world.
It's also the introduction of Dandelion, right?
Yes, it is
Yes.
the introduction of.
Yes.
I mean, we've heard
Yay.
from him in the Voice of Reason little half things between the stories, but it's the first story with him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you grow to love Dandelion. He is an
I already do.
optimistic idiot in that.
Oh, I love him. He's a smush.
He is just a dweeb in so many meanings of the term. But yeah, after that we have The Last Wish with Michal.
Yeah.
Which I'm sure, I can't wait because I know how you feel about Geralt and Yennefer. And it's just the beginning.
So in the first of what will become something of a running theme, Geralt and Dandelion try and make breakfast out of fish. They instead catch a genie's bottle. The genie attacks Dandelion and starts wreaking havoc on his voice and throat. Geralt rides to the town of Rind, but they're there at night and nobody is allowed through unless you're like a super noble human until morning. So they wait there. Geralt meets an elf named Chiraden and his cousin. They tell him that there is a sorceress who's defying the tax and the boycott of magic in Rind, and who can probably help. So in the morning, he goes to the sorceress's house, knocks the doorman unconscious because money opens all doors, and finds a sort of drunk, befuddled the merchant that the sorceress is living with, and then goes and brings her apple juice. She is sexy AF and tells him that she will help him, but she needs to take a bath first. So they sort of bathe, they parallel bathe and she makes herself invisible as they have a conversation, but he still kind of watches the water reveal this and that. I think it's she agrees to help. Geralt kind of also notes that Yennefer's beauty is is magically induced because sorceresses were usually started off as ugly girls. It gets a little complicated because Yennefer agrees to help and starts to help him, and then starts to help Dandelion. Geralt goes to check on them, and she puts Geralt under a spell that basically makes him go kick the ass of everyone who insulted her in the town. Geralt wakes up in prison with Jeraden, and they're like, man, we're fucked. The mayor shows up, and the priest shows up, and basically nobody there likes Yennefer, but they have different opinions on exactly what to do. Geralt is about to be killed, or they're like about to be taken to the scaffold, whatever. Geralt's getting beaten up, and then he wishes that, this is out of order, I don't care. He wishes that the guard will burst, and he does. Dandelion shows up through a portal and is like, I wish that you let him go, and that sort of clarifies things a little bit. Yennefer starts to try and snare the genie. She needs the last wish to be discharged so that she can get its full power, but Geralt knows that that's not going to work. Long story short, he goes to help her. They fall through a couple of portals. There are oysters and boobs, and Yennefer realizes that he is the master of the genie, and he makes his last wish, which is unstated in the book, but does something so that the genie can no longer kill Yennefer as it wants to. In the wreckage of the house, they are like, ooh, and then have sex. And he, at some point, Geralt's like, you were a hunchback, and this is like a big revelation to him. And then Jeraden finds them. Everybody thinks that Geralt and Yennefer are dead, but then they realize that nope, they are just enjoying each other's company in the wreckage. And there's also a go fuck yourself joke in the story.
Yay.
Woo!
Yeah, that's our introduction to the infamous Yennefer, who will play a big part in all the coming tales.
Yeah, I mean, it was really clear that she was going to be a major character. Like, I couldn't tell if any of the other characters would come back, but obviously her and Dandelion were, so.
Yeah, you learn just who Yennefer is. Someone who is incredibly vindictive if you cross her. Specifically, I'd like to quickly kind of read out what her punishment was for the people when she enchants Geralt to do her bidding. I fear, muttered Geralt, that wasn't the end of it. Your fears are well founded. You left the pawnbrokers and marched down the center of the street, jostling passerby and shouting some nonsense about a lady's honor. There was quite a crowd following you, Eredil, Ratimir, and I among them. Then you stopped in front of Laurel Nose, the apothecary's house, went in, and were back in the street a moment later, dragging Laurel Nose by the leg. And you made something of a speech to the crowd. What sort of speech? To put it simply, you stated that a self-respecting man shouldn't ever call a professional harlot a whore because it's base and repugnant, while using the word whore to describe a woman one has never knocked off or paid any money for doing so is childish and punishable. The punishment, you announced, would be dealt there and then, and it would be fitting for a spoilt child. You thrust the apothecary's head between his knees, pulled down his pants, and thrashed his arse with a belt. That's just kind of Yennefer's style. If you end up kind of making her look the fool, she will repay it like fivefold.
Or even try, honestly. You don't have to be successful.
Yeah.
The interesting thing about this story is that, like, the tables are a little bit turned on some of the, like, things that Sapkowski has relied on in terms of, like, consent and whatever, because Geralt and Yennefer's relationship, which I adore to pieces and is one of my favorite literary relationships, begins with a serious breach of consent of Geralt by Yennefer. She puts him under a spell and makes him do whatever she wants. And, like, that's not, you know, it's not sexual, but it sort of sets the tone in some ways for the way things are between them. And not necessarily in a healthy way. But then, are Geralt and Yennefer really healthy? I don't know.
Well, I like the idea that it's almost like mind rape except without the sex. You get some of that in Jessica Jones series where yes, there was actual rape, but there were also other characters who still were just taken over by the bad guy, and it still is traumatic and awful. So I kind of like that there. But here's the thing I don't get is, so at what point was he not under her control? All that stuff when he goes back after her, is that his own doing? Because, we get from the other elf who's like, nah, yeah, I can't control it. So does he genuinely love her, or did she just make him? Or is that residual? I wasn't clear at all what was going on there.
I don't think Yennefer's expecting it, because she's very surprised when he is trying to save her and stop her from doing this, because she's like, no, I want to do this, and if I die doing this, I'll die doing this,
Right.
Whatever Geralt wishes somehow binds their fates together, so that fact really surprises her. So I don't think it was intentional, but it's possible it was a side effect. But I like to think that Geralt kind of sees a kinship in Yennefer kind of from the beginning, that it's sort of a ruthlessness, but also a kindness in a, she does help Dandelion, and we don't know if she would have helped if she hadn't thought she could get the djinn out of it, but
No.
I feel like the answer is not necessarily no.
Well, that's a raving endorsement.
Well,
She might not be a total
it actually
dick.
sort of is.
And
Yeah.
I do feel like Geralt initially goes back to her simply because she's a person, and you learn that Geralt is above all a humanist. He believes in the better side of people. He knows that people will rarely devote themselves to the better side of humanity, but if there's a chance to just save someone who probably doesn't deserve death, he'll go for it.
This is a lot more than just saving someone.
Well, he does save her with his last wish, and it's only because he's able to bind her to him that he's able to save her. Otherwise, the djinn would have killed her.
Which, also, creates that question of how much they are, how much of their bond is kind of self-generated and how much of it is created by the wish.
Right.
Which I guess also calls consent into question, but, their relationship becomes so much more than, all of than this basis that, it's, I don't know. There's a part that, well, first of all, was just, being used to George R.R. Martin and his attempts at writing sex. I found the relationship between Geralt and Yennefer just much better.
Yeah.
Low bar though.
Well, he has a line they were caring and tender, and although neither quite knew what caring and tenderness were, they succeeded because they very much wanted to. And that seems really sweet and telling to me that that it doesn't come naturally to them to be necessarily nice or generous people, but there's kind of a value in effort, and having good intentions.
Mm-hmm.
Which maybe is maybe a sign of what Yennefer would have, maybe she sort of wanted to be generous to Dandelion and Geralt, but the only way she knows how to do that is to use it to her advantage.
I guess the thing for me was I just, as much as I want to be the romantic and true love wins out and all that shit, the woman just basically mind raped him, took over his body and made him do stuff against his will. And now suddenly, first of all, even just going back to save her seems a little excessive, but to be obsessed and basically in love with someone in that situation seems either really, really unrealistic or, somehow enforced or, coerced to me. I'd like to think it was all sweet and lovey, but yeah, she just took over your body and made you kill people, and yeah, you'd have probably been killed or thrown in jail for the rest of your life. I don't know. I just had trouble buying it.
Yeah, no, the stakes are very high.
I think it's just telling of Sapkowski in that I don't think he writes one pure love story in this book. Every major kind of love connection is messy and has like gross elements to it, like love usually is. Like there are awkward parts, there are parts where you're not sure if this is morally right or not, but then at the same time, these two characters still show desire and love for each other. You see it later in the books in a specific example, but like even like Geralt and Yennefer, who towards the end are kind of like the ideal couple, like they have messy beginnings too with this specifically. So I think it's just emblematic of the kind of love stories Sokowski is good at writing.
And there is a certain amount of ambiguity just in terms of like the technical details of their relationship, because when we are, meeting Geralt and when he's talking about Yennefer in the Voice of Reason, they were together and then they broke up and it was real messy, and Geralt was apparently just ran away in the middle of the night. We're not sure. It's not instantly perfect, but I think they both are like very needy people, and I think they're both perceived as being and want to be perceived as much like stronger and much more like powerful. Like Yennefer's physicality is partly, the like 80s fantasy writing. She really throws it in his face at one point, though. Like, I was able to do this to you because you were hardly paying attention because you were watching me wash my tits, and
Yeah.
They both want to put out that view of themselves, and I think they both kind of recognize that in each other. I don't necessarily buy the whole and she was a hunchback. I don't know.
Yeah.
The whole paragraph about how sorceresses are beautiful, women with the eyes of ugly girls. And I think there's something to be said for both of them experiencing less power than they do now, and kind of like a lot of what they do is in response to that experience. Certainly Yennefer, and I think Geralt also.
I had one question for all of you is so as to the three wishes, so at what point did you realize that he actually was getting the wishes and not Dandelion? And for me, the answer was with the second wish, it seemed really obvious, but I missed the first one totally. What was the first wish?
Okay, so the first wish is a joke that you're not supposed to really. Yeah, so he says, Geralt says that incantation. He throws that incantation that he heard a priestess say once, right?
When he's trying to exorcise the djinn.
Yeah.
Right.
And that is what ends up translating to go fuck yourself. So his wish is that the djinn goes and fucks itself, which it apparently had to do. Which I
can understand why it's angry now.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it wasn't obvious to me either, David. I think even by the second wish, I didn't get it.
I got it the second wish because he admittedly says, what was it exactly? It wasn't explode, but something to that effect.
Yeah.
Burst. And
you burst, and he did.
Up.
So at that point,
I know, but I was.
That's just too coincidental. I was like, no, that's got to be.
Obviously,
all right, and then I will end us with the Voice of Reason, which is the short story that is kind of interspersed.
Not a story.
Throughout.
Framing sequence.
Sorry, I'm gonna be a literary snob here. It's not a story. It's just connective tissue.
It's a framing sequence.
Yeah.
Oh, all right.
Although, it does have a solid story in there. There's a short one, but
parts of it.
All right.
Mainly the end. Go.
All right. So, it takes place in the Temple of Melitele in Elendor, which is part of the Kingdom of Nymeria, which is where Foltest is king. Geralt is being tended to by the priestesses of Melitele, specifically Mother Nenneca, who is kind of the high priestess there. He starts out being awakened by Yola, who is a mute servant, and they make love simply because he's Geralt. He's just a horny bastard. And he falls asleep thinking about his fight with the Striga. That's when it goes back to the Witcher story. By the morning, Nenneca wakes him up and says that he really needs to get better by entering into a trance, which would show him his future. He refuses because he doesn't believe in trances or the goddesses. He has profound respect for Mother Neneka, but at the same time, he is fairly staunchly an atheist. And then we get the story A Grain of Truth. Later on, two knights of the Order of the White Rose, Count Falwick and Sir Tails, arrive. They are ordered by the Prince of Ellender to chase Geralt out of town because he's a witcher, and witchers are gross, and you don't want them hanging around too much because they're basically vagrants. Geralt promises to leave in 3 days. Insulted, Tails challenges Geralt to a duel, and the knights promise to return. That's when we get the story The Lesser Evil. And then later we also have Geralt telling Yola about his history as a witcher and destiny, which is when we get the question of price. Later, Dandelion shows up, having heard of Geralt's adventure in Vizima with the Striga, and has just decided to see how he's doing. They talk about how the witcher profession is losing profitability in modern times because so many monsters are going extinct at this point. Later, Geralt talks to Neneka about Yennefer, wishing to give some of his payment from defeating the Striga to her, and he talks about how Yennefer and him first met. Finally, Geralt and Dandelion decide to leave, but they are waylaid by Falwick and Tails and a company of soldiers who are led by Dennis Cranmer, a dwarf captain. The knights tell Geralt that he either has to fight Tails, in which he must basically not hurt Tails, otherwise he'll be killed. So he basically has to throw the match. Geralt accepts but avoids punishment by causing Tails to injure himself. Dennis accepts the loophole and permits Geralt to leave, hoping to meet Geralt in the future. Before he leaves, Geralt touches Yola's hand, inducing a trance. Geralt, Yola, and Neneka see a bloody and violent vision of Geralt's future. Geralt dismisses the vision, claiming to have seen it before, and says goodbye to Neneka. I like these as kind of like a framing device for the rest of the stories, because it helps us first meet Dandelion, but also it gives us the amazing character of Mother Neneka, who is... I
assume she'll be important.
Sort of. She's not too much, but she does act as almost like Geralt's mother. Like, she judges his relationship with Yennefer and such, and she's also just like the sassy nun character, basically. I have one...
She's very much like, let me take care of you. I'm not your mother. Don't complain to me. Tell me all your problems. Shut up. I'm not your mom.
Why don't you call anymore? But one of my favorites is, you've a guest. Who is it this time? Duke Hereward himself? No, it's Dandelion this time, your fellow, that idler, parasite, and good-for-nothing, that priest of art, the bright shining star of the ballad and love poem. As usual, he's radiant with fame, puffed up like a pig's bladder, and stinking of beer. Do you want to see him?
Cool.
Of course, he's my friend after all. Neneka, peeved, shrugged her shoulders. I can't understand that friendship. He's your absolute opposite. Opposites attract. Obviously. There, he's coming. Your famous poet. He really is a famous poet, Neneka. Surely you're not going to claim you've never heard his ballads. I've heard them, the priestess winced. Yes, indeed. Well, I don't know much about it, but maybe the ability to jump from touching lyricism to obscenity so easily is a talent. Never mind. Forgive me, but I won't keep you company. I'm not in the mood for either his poetry or his vulgar jokes. And then Dandelion comes in. My deepest respects, venerable mother, he whined stupidly. Praise be to the great Melitele and her priestesses, the springs of virtue and wisdom. Stop talking bullshit, snorted Neneka, and don't call me mother. The very idea that you could be my son fills me with horror. She puts everyone in their place, specifically like when the knights come to tell Geralt off. And Sir Tails throws down the gauntlet. Neneka's like, pick that up, you dropped something. And like, she just dismisses everyone simply because she is kind of able to, because she's a priestess. She's only answerable to her goddess. And a lot of the people who do like talk to her kind of realize that.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like other than, the little bits with them, like all of the early framing sequences stuff are kind of like whatever. Like, we just need a point page. Like, it's the kind of thing you see in an anthology with different writers a lot. Like, hey, let's come up with some sort of thing to make all these stories fit together. But then, like, I feel like the last chapter like is actually an interesting story. Like I like the way he gets out of the fight, and obviously you get the big mic drop of the, oh shit, he's gonna have a pretty shitty ending here, a big bloody nasty one, like I'm reading that going like, oh, this is actually a big moment.
I agree. Like everything until like when the Knights of the White Rose kind of show up is kind of meh. And then you kind of once you get more of that actual conflict,
Right.
It becomes better. Yeah. All right.
Yeah, there's good character stuff in this for sure.
Yeah.
I also really, really, really like how how it starts with like, I've been hearing about like how great this is and blah blah blah, and it starts with the most like typical fantasy, like like her mantle brushed across her bare breasts.
Yeah.
Just like, really, Paul? Really?
Yeah. It's really all Paul's fault.
It is. It is my fault. But yeah, that is the Last Wish anthology of books. The next one we will be going through is Sword of Destiny, not Storm of Swords.
Can we do both at the same time, like a crossover?
No, we've already done a reread.
Can we do like a crossover, a linear crossover? Sorry.
But yeah. Also, because David asked that I bring this up for suggested order of doing things, I would say read the books. If you want to see the first season of the show, read the first 2 short story anthologies, and then I'd say like the beginning of maybe Blood of Elves to get everything from the show.
I mean, I don't mind a few spoilers here and there,
Okay.
or even, but I'm just saying in general, like
In general,
what
the
best
first
bet-
season follows kind of, it is very much like The Last Wish, where it's not fantastic, but it is enjoyable in parts.
Yeah, honestly, like I don't think there's. I would read Sword of Destiny, especially because if you've already read The Last Wish, then like you're kind of over the hump of like this is incomprehensible.
Yeah.
Right.
But that was very much helped by it helped me to watch the show first. So like it's not,
And there are,
nothing hugely consequential is going to be spoiled for you, and
I would definitely say read the books first, simply because they do things a lot better than the show.
well, there are ways in which the show
Oh,
improves,
the
I think,
show
It
on,
never happens.
The
on
show
story
does
level
very
things.
well with story things, but specifically like Brokilon Forest.
Right. Yes.
It's what I'm thinking.
Yeah.
That's
I mean,
another-
there's basically like from a feminist point of view, like like the show definitely goes like, we can do this a little better in a lot of
Right.
ways, which is appreciated. But I do agree that like there's a lot of the emotional core of stuff, and the pacing of the show kind of like definitely privileges some storylines over others.
yeah.
Right.
But-
And don't they also move up like Yennefer's storyline and I don't know the name of the other major
Well,
female
actually-
characters. They move a lot of that stuff up earlier, right? Because just to get us introduced
That's
to
not
the
a
characters.
lot of that is not in the books at all.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Like
Yeah.
all of you, like Yennefer's background story, that's just in the show. That's never really shown in the books. So yeah.
You're not going to bring the stars in a couple of seasons in.
Yeah. In regards to the video games, the video games take place 6 years after the book series. And
All 3 of them?
all 3 of them.
Interesting. Okay. So will there be major spoilers? Like, will I know, oh shit, this big thing's going to happen? Or
Yes, there
Okay.
will be big spoilers. I would say you're probably free to skip the first video game. It's not very consequential to the rest of the games, and it's not
Mhm.
very good. Witcher 2 acts pretty nice, where it's a very linear story. And it has like Witcher 2 and 3, the choices you make as Geralt really affects the outcome. I'd say Witcher 2 is like a linear, almost kind of politics, almost kind of like a Game of Thronesy thing, because you're Geralt thrown into a political situation and you need to kind of choose who you're going to trust, who you're going to side with. And then Witcher 3 is a much more grandiose time to save the day, but
Right.
also let me play some Gwent on the
Now,
side.
given how big 3 is, I mean, it's like one of the biggest video games of all time. Do you Is it something you might want you jump into 3, or would you really want? Will it be deeper and richer if you play?
It will be definitely deeper and richer if you play the second game beforehand, because you will meet characters that are only in the second game that are kind of interesting, with good background. But yeah, that would be my recommendation.
If for those who are listening who don't want to do 2, would you miss much? Like, will 3 make just as much sense if you skip 2, or do you really need 2?
I mean, yeah, it'll make
just curious
some sense.
For the listeners, give everyone the options.
I'm dedicating myself to getting Michal to play The Witcher 3 as the only video game. There is some lore stuff that you can get filled in, but like there's monologue in the game that will clean it up if you just want to start with Witcher 3.
Okay, just wondered. Thanks.
All right. Thank you for joining us on this adventure through Andrzej Sapkowski's first Witcher book, The Last Wish. The next one will, of course, be Sword of Destiny. I almost said Storm of Destiny. These words are too similar. We look forward to doing it then. So, goodbye.
Bye, everyone. Thank
Hopefully
you.
talk
This
to you all
was
again
fun.
soon.
Cheers.
Stay well.